The encounter. On the distant planet of Sailor, three powerful alien sisters ruled with an iron grip. Their names were Zora, Lyra, and Thera. They were known across the galaxy for their beauty, strength, and sharp minds. No one dared challenge them, for they were not only fierce warriors but also cunning rulers. The sisters had long looked down on humans, considering them weak and inferior. They found their small, fragile bodies laughable and their technology primitive. To them, humanity was nothing more than an amusing curiosity at best, and at worst, an obstacle to be ignored. The sisters sat on their grand, golden thrones, surveying their court. They wore flowing robes of silver and purple, each of them radiating power and authority. The throne room was filled with alien nobles, soldiers, and visitors from various planets. But there was one human in the room who stood out like a sore thumb, a young man named Jack. Jack had been captured after accidentally stumbling into their territory while traveling through space. He had no idea that he was trespassing on the homeworld of the most feared beings in the galaxy. In fact, he hadn't even known the planet existed until he had been brought here, in chains, after a surprise attack on his ship. The sisters regarded him with amusement as he stood before them, defiant and unafraid. Zora, the eldest and most powerful sister, leaned forward, a smile curling on her lips. "So this is the human who thought he could challenge us," she said, her voice laced with amusement. Her eyes scanned Jack up and down, judging him like a piece of meat. Jack stood tall, despite his chains. "I didn't come here to challenge anyone. I just got lost," he said, his voice calm and unwavering. The other two sisters, Lyra and Thera, exchanged skeptical glances. "A lost human, in the heart of our domain?" Thera asked, raising an eyebrow. "You must be more than just lost." Jack didn't flinch. He was used to being underestimated. Humans were often seen as insignificant in the galaxy, but Jack had learned that there was strength in staying calm and composed. "I didn't choose to be here," he said simply. "But now that I am, I guess I'll have to make the best of it." The sisters laughed, their voices echoing through the throne room. It was a mocking, cruel laugh. "Make the best of it," Zora repeated, shaking her head. "You're in no position to make demands, human. You're at our mercy." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around the room, taking in the alien faces, the dark, imposing architecture, and the sheer grandeur of the place. He knew he was out of his depth, but he wasn't going to let that show. "I'm not asking for mercy," he said. "I'm just here to find a way home." Zora's eyes narrowed. She was intrigued by the human's audacity, but she was also growing impatient. "You think you'll find your way home, after trespassing on our planet? You will learn that nothing happens here without our say-so." Jack's mind raced. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, the heavy silence pressing in. There was no way he could overpower them. He knew that. The sisters were far stronger than any human, but he wasn't going to beg or grovel. That wasn't the way of humanity. "I didn't come here to beg for anything," Jack said. "I'm not afraid of you." That comment struck a nerve. Zora stood up abruptly, her sharp alien features hardening. "Not afraid," she echoed. "You should be. You stand before the rulers of this world. And you dare speak as if you are our equal." The tension in the room thickened, the air growing heavy with the promise of violence. The alien nobles whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene or to wait and watch. Thera, the youngest sister, leaned forward with a gleam in her eyes. "He's not afraid of us," she said, a challenge in her voice. "Perhaps we should show him why he should be." Lyra, ever the strategist, stepped in. "No, Thera. This is an opportunity." She turned her gaze to Jack, who stood unmoving. "This human has courage. I've never seen a human behave like this before. He might be more than just a simple intruder." Zora raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her sister's words. "So you think we should let him go free?" Lyra shook her head, her smile widening. "Not free, but we can test him. If he truly is as brave as he seems, perhaps we'll find a use for him. Jack felt the shift in the room, the change in tone. He realized that they weren't just mocking him anymore. They were taking him seriously. It was both terrifying and thrilling. But his heart remained steady, and he knew that the worst was yet to come. He couldn't escape, but maybe, just maybe, he could turn the situation to his advantage. Zora looked at her sisters and then back at Jack. "Very well, human," she said, her voice cold. "You'll have your chance, but make no mistake, you are still in our world, and you will obey our rules." Jack nodded, not sure what was coming, but ready for whatever they threw at him. As the sisters turned away, the tension remained, crackling in the air like electricity. For now, he was alive. But Jack knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge had just begun. The king's command. The cold silence in the throne room stretched on after Zora's words. The three sisters stood tall and proud, their alien eyes locked onto the human before them. Jack could feel the weight of their gaze like a heavy force, but he kept his expression neutral. There was something about the sisters' presence, something that made him both nervous and oddly fascinated. They were beautiful, but there was a sharpness to them that hinted at a deep, ruthless power. But just as Jack thought he might be dismissed, a new tension entered the room. The doors of the throne room creaked open, and a messenger, cloaked in dark robes, stepped forward. The alien crowd fell silent, sensing something important was happening. The messenger's eyes were filled with urgency, and he spoke quickly. "Your Majesties," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The king has sent a message. He commands that the human be brought before him at once." The mention of the king's name sent a ripple of unease through the sisters. Zora's face remained impassive, but Jack saw a flicker of concern cross Lyra's sharp features. Thera, the youngest of the three, shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsettled by the news. "The king." Zora's voice was low, almost a growl. "Why would the king want to see this human? We have no time for this nonsense. Let him rot in the cells like the others." The messenger didn't flinch. "The king's orders are clear, Your Majesty," he replied. "He insists that the human be brought before him immediately." The sisters exchanged wary glances. In all their years of ruling, none of them had ever received such a direct command from the king. The idea that a human, a species they had long dismissed as beneath them, could summon the king's attention seemed almost absurd. The king had always kept to his own affairs, a mysterious figure who rarely involved himself in the lives of his subjects, especially not in matters concerning humans. Zora's lips curled into a thin smile. "This is madness," she muttered, but there was a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Very well," she said, after a long pause. "Bring the human to the king." The messenger bowed low and left the room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Jack stood there, unsure of what to expect. The sisters had been cold and threatening, but now he could sense that the situation had taken an unexpected turn. It was as if the ground beneath him had shifted, and he was no longer the prey, but a mere pawn in a much larger game. The sisters turned to him, their gazes colder than ever. "You'd better be prepared," Zora warned, her voice laced with warning. "You're about to meet the ruler of this galaxy, the king. Do not disappoint him." Jack nodded, though his heart was racing. The king. What did a king want with a lowly human like him? Was this some kind of trick? But there was no time to think about that now. His only choice was to follow them. As they led him down long, winding corridors of the palace, Jack couldn't help but marvel at the scale of the place. The walls were adorned with strange, shimmering symbols, glowing softly with an otherworldly light. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, but with an underlying metallic scent that hinted at the alien nature of this world. The deeper they went into the palace, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. They reached the throne room after what felt like an eternity, the heavy wooden doors standing tall before them. As they pushed the doors open, Jack caught his first glimpse of the king. He was a tall, imposing figure, seated upon a massive throne made of dark stone. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were an eerie, glowing blue. His features were sharp, his face marked with the wisdom of centuries. There was a quiet power about him, the kind that demanded respect without a single word spoken. The room was filled with a strange golden light, and Jack felt his breath catch as the king's gaze fell on him. The sisters stepped aside, allowing him to approach the throne. For a moment, Jack was unsure of how to act, unsure of what to say. But then the king spoke, his voice deep and commanding. "Human," the king said, his voice carrying a weight that made the air itself tremble. "I have heard much about your defiance, your unwillingness to submit to the sisters. Tell me, why do you not fear them?" Jack stood tall and met the king's gaze without hesitation. "Because fear is a choice," he replied simply. "And I choose not to fear." The king's expression remained unreadable, but Jack could see the faintest glimmer of something. Approval? Amusement? He couldn't tell. The silence stretched for a moment, thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Finally, the king nodded. "I see," he said. "You are a brave one, then. But bravery alone will not save you. The sisters may have mocked you, but I see potential." Jack blinked, surprised. "Potential? What do you mean?" The king's lips curled into a small smile, though it held no warmth. "I am a king, and I rule over all things. But the power I seek is not in strength alone. It is in the will to endure, to rise above adversity, to find the way forward even in the darkest of times." He paused, studying Jack for a long moment. "I have decided something," he said, his voice soft but full of authority. "You will remain here, under my watch. You will prove to me what humanity is truly capable of. I will see if your kind can truly live up to their potential." Jack's mind raced. Was this a test? A trick? But before he could speak, the king's gaze turned toward the sisters, his tone shifting to one of finality. "The sisters will watch over you. You will learn what it means to serve, to respect, and perhaps to become more than you ever imagined." The king's words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jack knew that his journey in this alien world was far from over. He didn't know what to expect next, but one thing was clear. The king had a plan for him, and it was more dangerous than anything he had ever faced before. The sisters, who had once mocked him, now eyed him with something different. Curiosity, perhaps even a hint of respect. They would be his challenge, but he had no intention of giving up. Jack was determined to survive, to prove that humanity was not to be underestimated. The king had spoken, and now Jack's fate was in his hands. The audience with the king. The throne room, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now seemed to hum with a strange electric energy. Jack stood before the king, still grappling with the enormity of what had just happened. The sisters, who had once looked at him with disdain, now stood silent, watching the unfolding drama with a mix of intrigue and caution. The king, seated on his imposing stone throne, regarded Jack with a steady gaze. His glowing blue eyes pierced through the human's every thought, and Jack felt the weight of those eyes upon him, as though the king could see into the very core of his being. It was unnerving, but Jack refused to flinch. He was no longer the frightened captive. He had made his choice, not to cower, but to stand his ground. The sisters, still in their regal robes of silver and purple, flanked the throne, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. They had no idea what the king was truly thinking, and that made them uncomfortable. Zora, the eldest and most powerful of the three, narrowed her eyes at Jack, trying to gauge what he was truly made of. Lyra, ever the strategist, studied the human more carefully, sensing that there was something about him that set him apart from the other humans they had encountered. Thera, the youngest, still wore an air of disbelief, as though she couldn't quite accept that a human had dared to defy them so boldly. The king spoke first, his voice deep, calm, and measured. You have been brought before me, human, because I see something in you. Something that intrigues me. The sisters believe you are just a weak, insignificant being, unworthy of our attention. But I believe you may be something more. Jack stood tall, trying not to let his nerves show. I don't know what you see in me, Your Majesty, but I can promise you one thing. I'm not here to waste your time. I'm here to find a way out of this place. I just want to get home. The king smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Home, he repeated, as though tasting the word. You are far from home, human. And you are far from the world you think you know. You will not leave this place easily, if at all. The sisters shifted uncomfortably. They were used to their power being unquestioned, but now the king had placed Jack at the center of his attention. Their world, their very rules, seemed to be shifting around them. Zora looked at the king, her face unreadable, while Lyra observed Jack more closely, wondering what had caught the king's eye. The king leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Jack. But perhaps, instead of being sent back to your insignificant life, you might prove yourself worthy of something greater. You see, I do not tolerate weakness, and I do not waste my time on those who cannot see the value in strength. If you wish to leave this world, you must earn it. I will test you, human, and you will face the trials that await you. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Trials. What kind of trials was the king talking about? The thought of more challenges was both terrifying and intriguing. But there was no way out. If he wanted to survive, he had no choice but to face whatever was coming. What kind of trials? Jack asked, his voice steady but his mind racing. The king's smile widened, but again, it was not warm. You will face the trials of this world, the very tests that the sisters themselves must endure. But you will do so as a human, and I will see if your kind is truly capable of more than they let on. If you fail, you will never leave. If you succeed, you may have the freedom you seek. Jack swallowed hard. The sisters, too, seemed uneasy at the king's words. They knew what kind of tests the king had in mind, and they were not easy. The king was not one to spare anyone, alien or human, from facing their darkest fears and most difficult challenges. But the king's gaze had never left Jack. It was clear that the human was more than just a plaything to him. There was something about Jack's defiance, his boldness, that the king found compelling. Your first trial will begin tomorrow, the king announced, rising from his throne. You will meet me in the arena, where you will face the creatures of this world. Only the strong survive. Only those who truly understand their purpose can overcome what lies ahead. The sisters looked at each other, their unease growing. They had heard whispers of the king's trials before, grueling tests of strength, wit, and survival, meant to break even the most powerful of beings. But a human, they couldn't fathom how Jack would survive. Yet something in the king's voice told them that this was not just a matter of survival. There was something else at play here. Lyra stepped forward cautiously, her voice filled with uncertainty. King, are you sure about this? The human, he is just that, the human. He is not like us. His body is weak, his strength limited. The trials are unforgiving. The king's gaze shifted toward Lyra, and his expression hardened. I know what you think, Lyra, but you forget one thing. Humans are capable of things we have never imagined. I've seen it myself. They may not have our strength, but they have something more, something that makes them dangerous. Lyra frowned but said nothing more. She knew better than to argue with the king, especially when he was so resolute. The others remained silent as well, watching as Jack's fate was sealed. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the moment settling on him. What happens if I succeed? He asked, his voice stronger than before. The king turned to him, his blue eyes glowing with an intensity that made Jack's skin prickle. If you succeed, you will have earned the right to leave this world. You will earn your freedom. And if you prove yourself worthy of my respect, perhaps, you will find your place in this galaxy, not as a prisoner, but as an ally. The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Jack's mind raced as the weight of the king's words sank in. The trials were his only chance to escape, but they also offered something more, something far greater than mere survival. If he could prove himself, he could change everything. The king turned away, his cloak swirling around him as he moved to a nearby balcony. Rest, human. Tomorrow, your journey begins. And remember this, failure is not an option. As the king's voice faded, Jack stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. The sisters turned away, their faces filled with doubt and suspicion. But Jack knew something they didn't. He had been given an opportunity. An impossible one, perhaps, but an opportunity nonetheless. Tomorrow would decide his fate, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The tension grows. The night before the trial, Jack lay awake in a small bare chamber within the palace. The walls were smooth and cold, with no adornment to distract him. His only company was the soft hum of alien technology filtering through the stone, and his own thoughts that spiraled endlessly. He had tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, his mind would snap back to the king's words. Tomorrow, he would face a test, a trial that could break him. He didn't know what to expect. The king's cryptic words echoed in his mind. Creatures of this world, only the strong survive. He had seen the strange, glowing creatures in the palace during his brief time here. Swarms of floating insects that glowed like fireflies, massive beasts that lurked in the corners of the palace, and more. Would he have to face them? Would the king unleash them upon him tomorrow? The sisters' faces also haunted his thoughts. Zora, with her cold, calculating gaze. Lyra, always watching him as though she saw something deeper beneath his surface. Thera, the youngest, with her restless energy and uncertainty about Jack's place in their world. They had been dismissive at first, mocking him like the others, but something had changed. A flicker of doubt now lived in their eyes, and that only made the tension thicker. Jack couldn't help but feel that the sisters were caught in a trap of their own making. They had always ruled with power and fear, but now they were under the watchful eye of their king. They were no longer in control. And though they hadn't shown it, Jack could tell they were unsettled by the king's command, just as much as he was. The sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside his cell, and Jack's heart skipped a beat. He tensed, expecting someone to come to drag him into the arena. But it was only the sound of a guard passing by. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though unseen eyes were tracking his every move. As the hours passed, Jack drifted in and out of a restless sleep. He kept thinking about his family, his home, the world he had left behind. It was a distant memory now, one that felt increasingly like a dream. He didn't even know if he would ever make it back. The thought of being stuck here forever, facing the king's trials with no end in sight, was a terrifying one. But he wasn't going to give up. No matter what happened, Jack had made a promise to himself. He would fight. When the first light of dawn broke through the chamber, Jack rose from the small cot and began to prepare himself for what lay ahead. His body felt stiff from the tension, but he forced himself to stretch. He had no idea what the trial would be, but he would need every ounce of strength, courage, and quick thinking to survive it. The arena was unlike anything Jack had ever seen. It was a vast, open space, surrounded by towering walls made of smooth black stone. The sky above was a sickly shade of purple, with swirling clouds that seemed to pulse with energy. Jack could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him as he stepped into the center of the arena, his bare feet sinking slightly into the dust beneath him. The ground was warm, almost hot to the touch, as though the earth itself had been scorched by some otherworldly force. The sisters stood off to one side, watching him silently, their expressions unreadable. The king, however, was nowhere to be seen, at least not yet. His presence hung over the arena, an invisible force that made the air feel thick with expectation. Jack swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He had no idea what to expect, but he couldn't back down now. He stood tall, his muscles tensed, and tried to focus on the task at hand. Without warning, the ground beneath him trembled. Jack's eyes widened as cracks appeared in the dust, and from them, large, clawed legs began to emerge. The creatures were massive, their bodies covered in thick, armored plates, their eyes glowing red with malice. They looked like something out of a nightmare, giant, insect-like beasts that hissed as they crawled out from the depths of the earth. Jack's heart raced. These were the creatures the king had spoken of. The trial had begun. The first creature leaped at him, its jaws snapping shut just inches from his face. Jack barely had time to react. He rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's deadly bite. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He couldn't take them head-on. He wasn't strong enough. But he was fast. He had to use that to his advantage. He spotted a series of jagged rocks scattered throughout the arena. His mind clicked into action, calculating the distance, the angles, and the movements of the creatures. They were fast, but they were also predictable, driven by instinct rather than intelligence. As another creature lunged toward him, Jack darted behind a boulder. The creature followed, but it misjudged the distance, crashing into the rock with a loud thud. Jack took his chance. He grabbed a sharp piece of rock, his hand shaking, and hurled it at the creature's exposed underbelly. The rock struck with precision, and the creature screeched in pain, stumbling back. For a moment, Jack thought he had it, but more creatures were coming, crawling from the cracks in the earth. The odds were stacked against him, and he could feel the weight of his fear creeping in. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had to keep moving, keep fighting. He darted between the creatures, using their momentum against them, dodging their strikes, and finding any weakness he could exploit. Each time one of them lunged, he managed to evade it, but he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He needed a plan, something to turn the tide in his favor. His eyes locked onto a large stone pillar in the center of the arena. It was massive, tall, and stable. If he could reach it, he might be able to use it for cover, and maybe even a chance to turn the tables. But getting there would mean facing the creatures head-on. With a deep breath, Jack made his move. He sprinted toward the pillar, using his agility to dodge the creature's attacks. One of them, faster than the rest, swiped at his legs, and Jack felt the claws scrape across his skin, sending a sharp pain through his body. But he didn't stop. He pushed forward, his will stronger than the pain. Finally, he reached the pillar, pressing his back against it and panting for air. The creatures circled him, their glowing eyes fixed on him as they prepared for the final attack. Jack's heart thundered in his chest as he realized the stakes were higher than ever. He couldn't fail. Not now. From somewhere high above, the king's voice echoed through the arena. "This is the moment, human. You have defied the odds so far. But now, you must prove that your will to survive is greater than their hunger." Jack clenched his fists, determination flooding his veins. He wasn't just fighting for his survival now. He was fighting for the chance to change everything. The battle was far from over, and Jack was ready for whatever came next. The human strength. The battle in the arena had been nothing short of brutal, but it had given Jack something he hadn't expected: confidence. The creatures, though terrifying and relentless, had failed to break him. He had used his wits and speed to outmaneuver them, finding ways to exploit their weaknesses, and with each strike, with each calculated move, he could feel his strength growing. But Jack knew this was just the beginning. The king's trials were far from over, and what he had faced so far was only a taste of the challenges that lay ahead. The sunless sky above the arena still pulsed with an eerie glow, and Jack's body ached from the cuts and bruises he had sustained in the fight. His clothes were torn, stained with dirt and blood, but he stood tall, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The creatures had retreated, vanishing back into the ground. But Jack knew they weren't gone for good. The king had a way of making the impossible seem like just the beginning. As the arena slowly emptied, Jack's mind raced. His first trial was complete, but it had been only a small victory in the grand scheme of things. The king's words echoed in his mind. Only the strong survive. He had survived this first test, but there were many more to come, and each trial would test not just his physical strength, but his resolve. The sisters, who had watched the battle from the sidelines, now approached. Their expressions were a mixture of disbelief and begrudging respect. Zora, the eldest, was the first to speak. Her cold, piercing gaze swept over him, as if she were measuring his worth. "You've done well, human," she said, her voice low, but there was no mocking edge to it now. "The creatures you faced are not to be taken lightly. Few have survived even one of them. But this was only the first test." Jack wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded, his eyes steady. "I'm still standing," he replied, his voice firm. "And I'll keep standing." Lyra, the second sister, stepped forward, her calculating eyes narrowing as she looked Jack up and down. She had been watching him closely throughout the battle, intrigued by his tenacity and his ability to outsmart the creatures. "You have a strength within you, human," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But strength alone will not be enough. The king has his reasons for testing you, and they are not just about your survival. You must prove something more. Your will to fight, your ability to adapt, it will all be put to the test." Jack met her gaze with unwavering determination. "I know," he said. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." Thera, the youngest sister, remained silent for a moment, but then her voice broke the tension. "You're different from the others, human," she said, her tone less hostile now, almost curious. "You're not like the ones we've seen before. Most humans would have been begging for mercy by now. But you seem to embrace the challenge." Jack gave her a tired smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I don't have a choice, and I don't want mercy. I want to prove that humans are stronger than you think." The sisters exchanged glances, and for the first time, Jack saw something flicker in their eyes. It wasn't contempt, nor was it pity. It was something more, a reluctant respect. Zora, the eldest, nodded slowly. "You have earned that respect for now," she said. "But know this, human. The king will not allow any weakness. Each trial will push you further than you think you can go. There will be no mercy, no reprieve." Jack's jaw tightened. "I don't need mercy," he said again, his voice stronger this time. "I just need to survive." As the sisters turned to leave, Jack took a moment to steady his breath. The pain from the fight still radiated through his body, but his resolve had only grown. The king's trials were far from over, and with each passing moment, Jack felt the weight of the challenge grow heavier. But there was something else, something he hadn't expected. Despite the odds, despite the pain, Jack was beginning to understand why the king had chosen him. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about learning to adapt, to overcome, and to push past the limits that others saw as unbreakable. Later that evening, Jack was brought to a new chamber, a place unlike the cold, sterile cells he had occupied before. The air here was thick with a strange energy, as though the walls themselves were alive. The room was filled with strange artifacts, glowing symbols etched into the floor, and a large, circular platform in the center. Jack couldn't quite place what he was looking at, but it didn't take long for him to realize that it was another test. The king appeared, his presence commanding, his blue eyes glowing with an intensity that made Jack's heart race. "This will be your second trial, human," the king said, his voice as cold and calculating as ever. "You've proven your strength in battle, but now you must prove your mind. You will face the trial of the mind. Only those who can conquer their fears, their doubts, and their weaknesses will survive." The air around Jack seemed to shimmer, and suddenly, the room around him seemed to warp. The platform in the center of the room hummed with energy, and Jack could feel his surroundings shifting. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavy and oppressive. He looked around, his heart pounding as the reality of the situation set in. The king's voice echoed in the chamber, distant but clear. This is the trial of the mind, human. You will face your greatest fears, your deepest regrets. You must conquer them, or you will be lost to them forever. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and suddenly, Jack was no longer alone. Shadows appeared before him. Shadows of people, places, and events that he thought he had long buried in his mind. His family, his friends, faces he hadn't seen in years, but who now stood before him, as if summoned by the king's trial. "Jack," a voice called out, a voice that sounded all too familiar. It was his mother, her face filled with sorrow. "You're not strong enough. You'll never survive this. You're just a human. You can't face them. You can't face your fears." The doubt crept into his mind, and for a moment he felt himself falter. He hadn't wanted to leave Earth. He hadn't wanted to be alone out here, in this alien world. The fear of failing, of never seeing his family again, gnawed at him. But then, a spark of realization lit inside him. He couldn't afford to let his fears control him. He couldn't afford to let them define him. "You're wrong," Jack said firmly, as he faced the illusion of his mother. "I am strong enough. I'll face whatever comes. I'll survive. I'll prove that humans can stand against anything." The shadow of his mother faded, and Jack felt the weight on his shoulders lift. But he knew this was only the beginning. The trial had just begun. Each fear, each doubt would come to him one by one. And Jack knew that he couldn't let any of them break him. He had faced the creatures of the arena. Now he had to face the demons in his own mind. This was the true test, and Jack was ready to face it. A test of willpower. The second trial had taken everything Jack had. It had dragged him through his worst memories, forced him to confront his deepest fears, and shown him how easily he could falter. Yet, despite it all, Jack had emerged stronger. The illusions of his past faded with each moment of defiance, each victory he claimed over the doubts that threatened to swallow him. But as the darkness of the trial cleared, Jack knew that the worst was yet to come. The king's voice, cold and commanding, had been clear. "You will face more trials, and only the strongest will remain." The third trial had arrived, and it would test more than his mind and body. It would test his very spirit, his heart, and his willpower. Jack was once again led to the grand arena, the air thick with anticipation. The sisters stood at their usual spot, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The king, however, was nowhere to be seen. There was no grand announcement this time, no dramatic gestures, just the silent, oppressive weight of the trial hanging over the arena. Jack could feel it in his bones. He wasn't just about to fight for survival anymore. This was different. This was about who he was becoming. As the thick fog that had enveloped the arena began to lift, Jack's eyes widened in shock. In the distance, there was no creature to face, no external threat. Instead, the arena had transformed into something more insidious, a vast expanse of water, stretching as far as the eye could see. The surface was smooth like glass, reflecting the eerie glow of the sky above. But Jack could see that the water wasn't calm. It was alive, swirling with strange, unseen currents beneath. He stepped forward, his feet sinking slightly into the soft sand. There was a strange chill in the air, a weightless feeling that seemed to press down on him from all sides. His pulse quickened as he scanned the horizon, wondering what kind of trial he would face this time. There were no beasts to battle, no creatures to slay. The king's voice echoed suddenly from above, piercing the silence. "This is the trial of endurance," the king intoned, his voice carrying the gravity of centuries. "It is not a trial of strength or wit, but of your ability to endure. You will face not the physical challenges that you have before, but the slow, grinding weight of despair." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Endurance. Despair. He could feel his stomach tighten. The king's words hung in the air like a curse. It was one thing to battle against physical opponents, but this was different. This would be a test of his mind, his spirit, his ability to keep going when every part of him screamed to give up. The arena began to shift again, and suddenly, the water in front of him was no longer still. Dark shapes began to rise from the depths, their forms twisted and contorted, resembling nothing Jack had ever seen. At first, they were mere shadows beneath the water's surface, but soon they broke the surface with a terrible roar. Creatures, half human, half beast, their faces twisted in agony and rage. Jack staggered back in surprise as the creatures climbed out of the water, their movements slow but deliberate. Their eyes glowed with a strange light, and their expressions were haunting, as though they had once been something human, but had been twisted by the horrors of this place. They did not move toward him in a rush, as the creatures had in the previous trial. No, these monsters were patient. They were deliberate. They would wait for Jack to come to them. The king's voice boomed across the arena again. These creatures represent the darkness that lies within you, human. The regret, the sorrow, the weight of all that you have lost and will lose. You cannot outrun them. You cannot fight them. You will face them, and you will decide how to endure. Jack clenched his fists. The words struck deep. He had known loss. He had known pain. His life on Earth had been one of quiet struggle, a battle against expectations and regrets that had slowly built up over the years. But this was something else. The monsters emerging from the water were not just physical threats. They were manifestations of his own inner demons. They embodied everything he had buried, every failure he had tried to forget. As the first creature stepped forward, Jack felt an icy wave of dread wash over him. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to stare directly into his soul. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as it reached out toward him, its hands long and clawed. The unexpected ending. Jack stood alone in the arena, the remnants of the trial of endurance fading into the air like smoke. His chest heaved with exhaustion, his body battered and bruised from the challenges he had endured. But as the last of the monstrous shapes slipped beneath the water, the oppressive weight of the trial seemed to lift. The arena, once dark and threatening, now felt almost calm, as though it were waiting for something to happen. For a moment, Jack thought he might collapse from sheer exhaustion. But then, a deep voice rang out, echoing across the silent expanse. "You have done well, human." It was the king's voice, powerful and commanding as ever. Jack turned to face the source of the voice, and there, atop a high platform overlooking the arena, stood the king himself, his blue eyes glowing with a faint but undeniable approval. His presence was both regal and intimidating, but there was something different now. There was a certain respect in the king's gaze that hadn't been there before. Jack straightened up, brushing the dirt and sweat from his face, trying to steady his breath. His body still ached, but he wasn't about to show weakness now. The trials had been grueling, but each one had taught him something valuable about himself, something he hadn't fully understood before. The king spoke again, his voice softer but no less commanding. "You have proven yourself worthy, not only to survive, but to understand the heart of the challenge. The trials were not meant to break you, but to test your spirit, your will to endure. And you have passed them all." Jack could hardly believe what he was hearing. The trials had felt like an endless barrage of obstacles, each one harder than the last. At times, he had wondered if he could make it, if he would ever make it out of this alien world alive. But somehow, despite the odds, despite the fear that had constantly threatened to overwhelm him, he had kept going. And now, it seemed the king was acknowledging that. "You have shown what humanity is capable of," the king continued, his gaze unwavering. "It is not your strength that impresses me, nor your cunning. It is your spirit, your determination. The strength to rise again, to fight when all seems lost. That is what sets you apart." Jack's heart beat faster, not from fear this time, but from something else. Pride, perhaps. He had fought through every trial, every test, and now he was finally being recognized for what he was, a human capable of overcoming the impossible. But even as he basked in the king's praise, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming, something that would change everything. The king stepped down from the platform, his presence dominating the arena. He moved with purpose, his every step measured and deliberate. As he approached Jack, the air seemed to hum with tension. There was no turning back now. "You have proven yourself worthy of the trials," the king said, his voice now almost gentle. "But there is one final decision to be made. You have earned your freedom, human. You may leave this world and return to your own. You may return to your life, to the people you left behind." Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. After everything, the battles, the pain, the doubts, he had earned the right to leave, to go back home. For a moment, it seemed too good to be true. But then, as if sensing Jack's hesitation, the king added, "But freedom comes at a cost." Jack's heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in his mind. Freedom comes at a cost. What did that mean? The king's eyes bored into him, as though he were reading Jack's thoughts. "You see, human, your journey has not just been about surviving these trials. It has been about understanding the value of the choices we make. The cost of freedom is not always clear, but it is always real." Jack felt a cold knot form in his stomach. What was the king trying to say? What cost was he talking about? "You have shown the strength of your spirit," the king continued. "But now you must decide whether you will accept that freedom. There is a power within you, something that has been awakened through the trials, a power that could change the course of history. But if you choose to wield it, you will no longer be just a human. You will be something else, something more." Jack's mind raced. He had faced the challenges, conquered his fears, and survived. But this was different. The king was offering him a choice that seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. Could he really take on such power? What would it mean for him? For humanity? The king's gaze softened, as though he could see Jack's internal struggle. "It is not a decision to be taken lightly, human. You have earned the right to leave, but you also have the opportunity to stay, to wield a power that could alter the very fabric of this galaxy. The choice is yours." Jack stood there, his body aching, his mind spinning. On the one hand, he could return home, go back to Earth, and try to pick up the pieces of his life. But on the other hand, the king was offering him something more: power, purpose, a chance to change everything, to rise above the limitations of humanity and become something greater. What would it mean to leave behind his humanity, to accept this power and embrace a new role in the universe? What would it mean to stand at the king's side, wielding that kind of strength? Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. He had fought for his survival, for his freedom, but now he had to fight for something else: the right to choose who he would become. He could feel his heart racing, but there was a sense of clarity that had been absent before. Whatever he chose, he knew it had to come from within. "I choose to stay," Jack said, his voice steady and filled with resolve. "I choose to fight, to make a difference, to change what humanity is capable of. I won't run from this. I'll face it." The king's expression shifted. For the first time, there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, perhaps pride, perhaps approval. "Very well, human. You have chosen your path. You are no longer just a survivor. You are a leader, a force to be reckoned with." Jack felt something shift inside him, as if a door had opened to a new world. The power that had been awakened within him stirred, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an opportunity, an invitation to rise above. The king stepped closer, his voice soft yet commanding. "You will no longer be alone in this journey, human. You will have the power to shape the future of this galaxy. The trials are over, but your real test has just begun." With those final words, the king turned and walked away, his form fading into the shadows of the arena. Jack stood alone, his heart still racing, his mind still reeling from the weight of his decision. He had chosen to stay, to embrace a new destiny. And as he looked out across the arena, the weight of the galaxy seemed to settle on his shoulders. But Jack wasn't afraid. For the first time, he felt truly free, not because he had earned the right to leave, but because he had chosen his own path, a path that would lead him to greatness, to something far beyond the confines of what he had once known. And as the stars began to shine above, Jack knew that this was only the beginning.